Hello and welcome to the SOFA series. I'm Erin Selby. I'm not the host. Well, I am the host tonight, but I am the Director of Education and Training for UFCW Local 832 in Winnipeg. We may have people joining us from outside of Winnipeg, outside of Manitoba. For all of you, I welcome you here. I'm expecting that we're going to have a lot of people on this call who are quite informed with this particular topic, but hopefully you'll be able to learn a little bit here. And just before I get to our special guest, I do want to let you know that if you want to talk or you want to share something, at the bottom of your screen, there's a Q&A. You can put questions in there. And if you pull up the more with the 3 dots, you will see that it will also allow you to chat with everybody or with one particular person. We won't be able to see you or hear you, but there is a way for you to get involved. So let me introduce you to our first, not our first guest, our only guest. Our expert tonight is Anya Moody-Foster. She is the Learning and Engagement Supervisor for the Manitoba Museum. Thank you so much for being with us, Anya.
My pleasure.
Before we get started, I did want to ask you a little bit about yourself. You've been with us before. This is the second time we've seen you. I'm just curious, how does someone become the Learning and Engagement Supervisor at the museum? What's your background? How do you get that job?
Yeah, that's a great question. So essentially in learning and engagement, we do everything from, school field trips to programs for seniors, programs for babies, everybody in between. And so, yeah, I've been really lucky to be at the museum for 22 years. My background, my educational background is in history. So I'll be using a little bit of that tonight. But one of the super exciting things about working in a museum is that, like ours, is that you're always learning new things. So I'm also like the dinosaur person and the rock and mineral person and can tell you about turkey vultures and things like that. So that's what's really exciting about working at the museum is that, we have so many amazing colleagues doing research. A lot of what I'm going to be sharing with you tonight is courtesy of our curator of history, Roland Swatsky, who put together our Strike 1919 exhibit. So I've been very lucky to be able to explore Manitoba's nature and history with people of all ages for many years.
Well, we are excited to have you take on this particular topic tonight. So I'm going to turn it over to you. And again, if people have questions or they want to chat, just go at the bottom of your screen and we will address your questions at the end. Take it away, Anya.
Awesome, thank you. And so Erin did say expert at the beginning, so I'm going to disavow that. But as I was telling her earlier, the 100th anniversary of the Winnipeg General Strike was just a few years ago, and the museum put together an exhibit, which is really actually kind of quite different from something we'd ever done before. We called it an intervention into the galleries, and in many ways that was very appropriate because the strike, of course, was a disruption to regular everyday life here in Winnipeg, and so that exhibit is still partially available. We are open here at the Manitoba Museum. We're open Thursdays to Sundays, 11 to 5. And within our new Winnipeg gallery, we do still have many of the elements of the Strike 1919 exhibit, plus new exhibits related to that, which I'll mention as we go along. So I'm really excited to share this with you. So I'm just gonna give me 1 second to share my screen, and then we can make sure we have sound. And there we go. Okay. There we go. And so the strike is really, one of these really significant moments in Canadian history. When we talk about historical significance, we talk about historically significant events, historically significant people, and because sometimes it's about changes that have happened, but it's also about events or actions revealing things about Canadian society. And so the strike definitely puts a lens on relationships in Canada in 1919, and especially in our current situation of the pandemic. The experience of being part of one of these major historical events has really caused me to think a lot more about aspects of the strike. And I'm sure that those will be relevant for you as well. And so when we talk about the Winnipeg General Strike, we often talk about it as the biggest strike in Canadian history. And so back again to this idea of significance, there have been many strikes in Canadian history and significant for different reasons. But I would say from our exhibit that we have here at the museum, that one of the key things that we want people to question is that the significance of the strike really looked at authority in society and raises the question of who's in charge, who has power and who does not, and what happens when you challenge power and authority, as certainly happened in the strike. The other thing about the strike is that it happened right here in Winnipeg. So I'm coming to you from my office here at the museum, and the events of the strike, I'm looking out my window down Main Street. Many of the significant events happened right exactly where I am or in this neighborhood. I'll just show you this photo here. So this is a photo from June 10th, 1919. And these are special police officers who will talk about what that means. They're marching down Portage Avenue. And I just love this, now and then kind of effect of this photograph, that these historical events were happening right here in the streets of Winnipeg. And I'll just give a shout out to where I got this, shifting photo is from an app called On This Spot. So if you are interested in Winnipeg history, I would recommend that app. You can go downtown, you can socially distance and give yourself a walking tour and see many of these now and then photos. But yeah, definitely an event that, affected the whole city and drew the attention not only of all of Canada, but North America and beyond. And oops, so if we go back to 1919, it's a very different time from today. There are not nearly the same kind of legal protections and regulations about workplace health and safety, about the right to unionize. The workers are often working in very unsafe conditions. And so this crazy kind of factory here, you notice all the women are wearing, their hair covering. And that's one of the good reasons for that is because you can see there's these belts coming down from, I shall put my little highlighter thing on. There's these belts coming down from the ceiling and making this machinery go. So pretty unsafe, fire regulations, regulations about the length of day, getting breaks, things like that. Those did not exist in the way that they do today. Of course, it's a very particular time in history. We've just finished the First World War or Great War. And I want to just get everybody thinking. And I was saying to Erin that I'm sure there are those of you in the crowd who probably know way more than me about certain aspects of the strike because there's so much to know. But when we think of the First World War, we don't always, we tend to focus on certain things in our knowledge. So I'm just going to just a short little poll out there. Let me just find that. So hopefully you can see this. I'm putting a poll up and you can feel free to answer on Zoom here. And just vote who can tell me who was Canada fighting against in the First World War. Just think back because it might not be the countries that everybody thinks of. Yeah, so we'll just give you a couple minutes. Not minutes, just a little bit of time. Don't worry if you get it wrong, no problem. Okay, and just in case you're not using like the Zoom app or have the Zoom client downtown and you can't see the poll, I'll just read out what it says. It just says, which countries was Canada fighting in World War I? Was it Russia and Japan, Germany and Japan, the Austro-Hungarian Empire and Germany, or Germany and Italy? So I'll give you about 10 more seconds to vote. There we go. Okay. Yeah, so I'm glad I asked this question because only about 40% of you knew that it was Germany and the Austro-Hungarian Empire who Canada and other allies were fighting against. And so I don't blame you for not knowing the Austro-Hungarian Empire because it disappeared after the First World War. The Austro-Hungarian Empire is, surprisingly, or not surprisingly, I guess, one of the players in our story today, and had influence on people's perceptions of those people here in Winnipeg. And so soldiers coming back from the First World War after, brutal years of war and sacrifice. Some people have done very well during the war and made profits, but for the most part, this is a very economically challenging time. These soldiers are returning to Winnipeg, but there's a great unemployment. And after years of hardship, it only seems that is continuing. And Winnipeg is in a very distinct position in Canada. We're the third largest city in Canada at this time, having grown incredibly quickly in the early 20th century. And so Winnipeg really was a divided city. And so just north of where I am tonight, just down Main Street, there are the railway tracks that go along near Higgins and Maine there. That railway track was the dividing between the north end of Winnipeg and the south end of Winnipeg. And so the photo that we're seeing here, this is from the early 20th century in the north end of Winnipeg. And you'll see, the houses in this area have been built very quickly. They're not good quality housing. It's because there was just this huge need for housing because of all the influx of immigrants. About at least a quarter of the population of Winnipeg were new immigrants. So this was a greater percentage than any other city in Canada at the time. And the other thing I just want to draw your attention to, so we can see, it's certainly not an affluent looking neighborhood, as I said, poorly built housing. But the other thing is you'll notice that the streets are not paved. And when I talk about this to kids, and I can't resist with adults too, at that time, in this area of the city, there was no running water and there were no sewer systems. And so you had to go to what they called a box closet, which is like an outhouse, but instead of going into, a pit in the ground, the waste would be collected in a box at the bottom of this little outhouse. So you can only imagine how smelly and unpleasant that might be. But the other thing is that this was a problem for disease. And so in the north end of Winnipeg, we had typhoid epidemics. And so this is, waste and getting into the drinking water system and such, and affecting many people, particularly in the north end. So you have we're really a city of contrast where you have the poor, new immigrant areas of Winnipeg. And this is in great contrast to the south end of Winnipeg. So here we see a little scene from the museum's Winnipeg gallery, where we have wealthy Mrs. Garvin and her maid Alma. And if you come to the museum, you can hear a conversation between the two of them during the strike. And so Winnipeg at this time had more millionaires per capita than any other city in Canada. So there's a definite disparity, very obvious between rich and poor here in Winnipeg. And of course, there were people who are actively, trying to change things. And there was a labor movement here in Winnipeg. And this is a photo. This actually, let me just see what is the year. This is I don't have the year written down, but this is a strike. Oh, sorry, 1917. There it is. So this is during the war, before the Winnipeg General Strike. And these are, and I love this title, Winnipeg Girl Clerks Go Out on Strike and Throw Out Pickets Around 2 Stores. So this is the Woolworth strike of 1917. So Woolworths was like the Dollarama of its day. They called it a 5-cent store, and it was where you could buy cheap goods. Now, these young women who worked in the stores, they were expected to work 6 days a week, 12 hours a day, and they were paid $6 a week. So basically, $1 for 12 hours of work. And to give you an idea of what that could buy, here in the museum, we have a cafe. At the cafe, you can buy a sandwich for 10 cents. You can buy waffles with bacon for 35 cents. And so you see that your $1 that you earn for that 12 hours of work is, not very much. And part of this is because there's definitely a gender disparity in how people are paid. There's an idea that the man is the breadwinner, and therefore, as they call them, the girl clerks, they're just working so they have some extra pin money so they can buy themselves, a hat or some nice things. But that wasn't the case for many women, particularly women who did not have a partner or a partner able to work. And of course, this is wartime. So many of these women were trying to make a living on $1 a day and not getting very far on it. And so their radical demands is that they wanted a raise to $8 a week and a half a day off more a week. And they wanted recognition of their union. And so labor leader Helen Armstrong was the one who encouraged these young women to strike and demand better pay and better treatment. And we'll certainly come back to her as we talk about the strike. The girl, yeah, Erin would call herself the girl director. I don't think I would call you that, no. But yeah, certainly different language of the time. And we're going to see that over and over again as we look at some things written in the time period. So the Woolworths Girl Crew, they were successful. They did get their $8 a week. They did get their half day off. And those who went on the picket line, they pretty much all lost their jobs and their union was not recognized. And so those hired after would benefit from their sacrifice. And so one of the things that people were fighting for in sort of the bigger picture thing was a minimum wage. And at that time, it was a minimum wage specifically for women. So there is this activity going on. And the other thing that I just wanted to put sort of the context of this huge event here in Winnipeg is in kind of the broader context of colonialism. So as much as the people in the general strike are referred to as, enemy aliens, and we'll talk about what that means. Many of the leaders in the trade union movement were men of British background. And if those of you, the other thing that happened in 1919 that was of huge significance to Winnipeg was the completion of the aqueduct from Shoal Lake that brings water to Winnipeg. And actually, I didn't acknowledge today when I started my presentation that I am here on Treaty 1 land, but I also every day do drink, just as all the other residents of Winnipeg drink Treaty 3 water. And treaties are all about many things, but partly about the sharing of resources. And One of the interesting stories of the Winnipeg General Strike, and what I always like to think about is, who is sort of left out of this story? And so for Indigenous people at this time, there's not a huge presence in the city of Winnipeg. Unlawfully, essentially, many Indigenous people are really confined and can't leave their reserves. And this would be without the permission of the Indian agent and other government officials who really control their lives. And so this would be the case for Shoal Lake 40, which is the First Nation where our Winnipeg drinking water still comes from today. And so how does this get back to the strike? Well, this picture here, we can see here the mayor of Winnipeg, and we can see the presidents of the Trade and Labor Council of Winnipeg. And they're talking about the building of the aqueduct from Shoal Lake. And so what the president of the Trades and Labor Council is doing is he's advocating that the men who work on this huge construction project should be from the area of the Winnipeg Water District, essentially the city of Winnipeg, where the water is going. And so basically, he is working with the mayor and trying to get a seat at the table to decide this. And then this is agreed to, that all the men who work on the project will be from the city of Winnipeg. And this essentially excludes the Indigenous people from the community in which the aqueduct is originating. And early on, Indigenous community there had provided labor for this project. And then after this agreement, they were essentially cut out of it. And so one of the things that, again, this idea of who's in charge, labor is working very hard. Labor leaders are working very hard to have a seat at the table, to stand up for the rights of workers. But sometimes in doing so, they trample on the rights of others. So just an important context to keep in mind. And the labor movement is not free of the prejudices of Canadian society at that time. This gentleman here, his name is John Robinson. He's featured as part of our Winnipeg Personalities Wall. And he was an immigrant to Winnipeg, and he came here and he worked on the railway as a porter. Railway porters are basically servants on the train who help people with luggage, shine shoes, make up beds, and such, and work very, very long hours on the train. And so the railway workers did have a union at this time, but it was a whites-only union. So railway porters, like Mr. Robinson, were not allowed to join that union. And so he said, well, forget that. We're going to form our own union. And so that's another really important milestone in Canadian labor history, is that the first all-Black union in North America was actually formed here in Winnipeg in 1917 with John Robinson as one of the leaders. And they would make an agreement with their employer for improved wages and some improved working conditions. And despite not being welcomed by the broader labor movement in the rest of the railway union, the order of sleeping car porters here in Winnipeg, they would support the Winnipeg General Strike, and in fact would make a generous donation to the strike fund. So again, just thinking who's at the table, who's not, even within the labor movement. Now, the other really important background thing that I really didn't appreciate before, it used to be when I would teach about the Winnipeg General Strike, I would say, okay, so there's a war and there's this and there's this. And yeah, there's that influenza pandemic, because I really didn't appreciate how much the influenza pandemic of 1918 would have impacted the lives of the people of Winnipeg. And I'm sure you all, a year and a bit ago would not have appreciated it in the same way that, of course, we all do today. And so, yeah, so the flu hit Winnipeg as it hit all around the world in 1918. And we can see here, I'll just switch to my pen, you know, churches and theaters closed, overcrowding in stores stopped by store managers, spitting bylaws enforced for the first time in years. So many of the same sort of, trying to isolate people and such was happening in 1918, so in the year leading up to the strike. Of course, unlike us, they did not have vaccines to protect them, and we're just very lucky that eventually the flu would sort of peter out. But I want to draw your attention to the section here. So they don't have vaccines, but here's some of the advice. It says, stay home, go to bed, call a physician, keep away from others and keep away from work. So this is still an issue today, right? So we still have these calls, I myself, as a union member, in my collective agreement, I do have 6 days. Many in our society today do not. And certainly in 1918, most workers not only did not have sick leave, but often didn't have adequate housing, where you can have, sleep in a warm, well-ventilated room is the advice here. So while the pandemic started sort of in the middle class areas of Winnipeg, it would be most deadly and impactful in the poorer areas. But just like today, at that time, the Spanish flu, clearly showed its impact on different communities in a differential way. So that is all the background to the starting of labor unrest here in Winnipeg. And so the first group, sort of the immediate causes of the general strike is a strike by the railway workers, the metal workers and the construction trade. So May 1st, 1919, the metal workers go out on strike. They're looking for recognition of their union. They're looking for better pay. They're looking for a shorter work week. And so they go out on strike, and this gets everyone talking. And so I have just a little image here of some artifacts from the time that represent different trades. Different groups and associations would begin to discuss, should we support this strike? Should we make this something bigger? So you have the people who work on the streetcars, who work in factories, who work, this is I think the Paper Hangers and Decorators Union here, people who work in the restaurant industry, people who were the bricklayers. And so we do have these organizations here in Winnipeg that are talking about should they join the strike. And so what are these labor organizations that they have at this time? So this is one of the artifacts that's in that case. And this is, I just find this fascinating. And so this is a ribbon. So if you were to go to a union meeting 100 years ago, you would likely have a ribbon that you would wear on your chest for these official occasions. Sort of showing part of your, solidarity and your group identity. And so we can see, sort of the messages on this. So this is the pin part. It says, in union, there is strength. This is the Canadian flag and the American flag. So this is an international union. Again, that question of who's in charge, these union movements is cross national boundaries. At this time, there's a movement where people want to have the one big union. People want the ribbons, yeah. I really love these ribbons. And so this ribbon is from the Amalgamated Sheet Metal Workers International Alliance, Local 31 here in Winnipeg. And you can see metal cutting shears, and this is some kind of hammer, and this is a soldering iron in the middle here. But what I find so fascinating about these ribbons is that when you flip them over, there's an in memoriam side where we have the same design but in black. And so this harkens to the other role of unions, that at a time, you know, when there's no Medicare, there's no social safety net like we have today, that unions and other, you know, workers' organizations might be the only resource that your family can turn to. So not only solidarity in working life, but also in supporting people through tragedy and death, sometimes death in the workplace. So the fact that, you know, these ribbons, and there's a whole set of them in that case, that they all have this on the back. So it shows how the unions were so important in people's lives. And particularly, I come back to this idea of the main breadwinner. The idea that, you know, if, and especially in wartime, if the head of the house, you know, dies or is not able to work, that this could devastate a family. And so death benefits, paying for funerals would be a role of unions at the time. So let's get back off this laser thing. So we have now at the museum, not just our temporary exhibit, but things on permanent display in our new Winnipeg gallery. And this section here is called City of Contrast, and it talks about, you know, more contemporary issues, I don't know, more movement, but in the same context, the Winnipeg general strike. And one of the artifacts that's in there that I find really cool is this voting box. So this belonged to the Winnipeg Trades and Labor Council. And this is how different groups would get together and they would voted for whether or not they would support the idea of a general strike. And so basically, you don't have to, it's both a secret ballot and you don't have to be able to read to be able to vote. So basically, you could pick up one of these balls and you vote. If you're voting yes, I want to support the general strike, you put a white ball. If you don't, you put a black ball. And then it goes in this hole, and then this hinged compartment is where all the balls are gathered. And then at the end, it can be counted, and yes or no. And the vast majority of these groups would vote yes and in support of the strike. And one of the things that really I think a lot about is how this communication happens. Okay, so like, you know, people might have heard about this talk tonight on Facebook. You know, we're all so interconnected. How did this messages about the strike, how did they spread? And so, yes, union meetings and voting and such, but also, you know, huge crowds would gather during the strike in places like Victoria Park. So Victoria Park doesn't exist anymore. It's actually just to the south of where I am, or sorry, to the east of where I am, along the river between where the museum is on Main Street and the river. And, you know, thousands of people would gather in that space. And also, many of our labor leaders were also ministers. So sometimes these messages and this discussion of labor and striking was coming on at the part of the Sunday sermon. So a huge support for the strike. And so it's decided that workers across Winnipeg will go out and strike in support of the metal workers and the construction workers, but with bigger ambitions of their confirming and getting recognition of their rights to form unions. And I'm just going to do another little poll here. Let me put that up. Oh, where's my thing? Okay, then we won't do the little poll. But it ends up that it's 30,000 workers go on strike. Only about less than half of them are actually part of these existing labor organizations. And so about 11,000, 12,000 people vote to go on strike within their organization, but a whole bunch of other workers respond to the call. And the very first group to go out on strike would be what the people we call the Hello Girls. So back then, of course, you couldn't like dial directly to your friends. You had to speak to the operator. So you would ring the phone, you would hear a voice, operator, what number would you like? And these young women were known as the Hello Girls because they were so pleasant and they would say hello, you know, but they were also tough. I mean, I think many of you probably work in service industries where you know that being nice all day is really hard work. And so these young women were tough. And so the general strike was called to happen on May 15th at 11 o'clock in the morning. The shift change for the telephone operators came at 7 a.m. and they said, forget it. We're not waiting until 11. We're going for it. We're starting going on strike. And 30,000 people in a city. And so at that time, Winnipeg's what, 180,000 people? So that is a huge, significant number of people to all go out, and especially in a time where, you know, communication is not easy. And so the strike, very successful. The strike leaders say, basically, we don't want confrontation, you know, so stay home. This is going to be our power. We're going to stay home and we're just going to stop this city. We're going to shut it down. And so if any of you have ever been on strike, you know that this is a bold move. This is a sacrifice. And for many, it might be an even bigger sacrifice than for others. And so we remember those Woolworth girl clerks who, you know, have now successfully made $8 a week. That's really, really difficult to live on. And so that means that you don't have a savings. You aren't getting much like a strike pay. So to go on strike would be a real personal sacrifice. And so here we see again the lady who was behind the Woolworth strike, Helen Armstrong, who is one of the most fascinating people in Manitoba history. And she recognized this right away, that the burden of the sacrifice of being on strike affected particularly these young female workers more than others. And so what she did is she set up what she called the Labor Cafe. And so this is the Strathcona Hotel. It was exactly right here on Rupert and Main, where the Manitoba Museum is today. And using volunteers, they would serve about 1,500 meals a day. So pretty amazing. And the fact that people stuck to it. So here we see, you know, we're 10 days into the strike. This is Portage Avenue. There is not a soul in sight. And things are really shutting down. But of course, as we all know really well today, is that there are certain things that are essential services. And we think a lot about that today. And thank you so much, so many of you, you know, who are involved in our essential services and our frontline work. And so it was recognized that certain things needed to continue. And so the Strathcona Hotel restaurant, where the Labor Cafe was, you can see here's my colleague Alex, and they put up in the window of the Strathcona Hotel in our exhibit saying permitted by the authority of the strike committee. Now, this is one of those things in the strike that really riled up people who were against the strike. And so these placards were probably one of the things that caused you know, the most anger during the strike. And it actually came out of a very cooperative experience where strike leaders and people from the city talked about, well, you know, what are we going to do about essential services? Things like milk and bread delivery. You know, the delivery people were on strike. And some of the headlines in the newspapers that were against the strike, said, the strikers are keeping milk from babies. They're baby killers. That's literally, what it was saying in these articles. And so, of course, the strikers were not for keeping milk from babies, but they also knew that, if delivery people continued their work, that there were people in the community who would try and stop them. And there was some violence during the strike. And in fact, actually often groups of women who attacked delivery drivers. There were several incidents like that. And in fact, labor leader Helen Armstrong would be the person who was most arrested. She was arrested many times for disorderly conduct during the strike. And so, in order to protect these essential services, they made this agreement that they would create these placards to go on the delivery wagons. They never discussed, apparently, what it would say, but the labor leaders went and they had these printed because, of course, printers were on strike. And this is what they wrote: they wrote permitted by the authority of the strike committee. So this is where I come back to that question of who's in charge. And this incensed the business leaders of the community, saying, why should these, strike committee, decide, what services can continue? So this became very controversial sticking point. And there definitely were those in the community, who were on both sides. And I'll get you to look here. So this is City Hall. And this is the Veterans Associations. Most returned soldiers were in favor of the strike, but many were not. So this is a group of soldiers who are against the strike, and they are demonstrating. This is City Hall, and you can see they're, connecting the strikers to Bolsheviks and the Russian Revolution, of course, on top of mind at this time. But I just want to drive my favorite sign is to support the undesirable alien, and we certainly do see, have seen prejudice and against immigrants and such, particularly, I'll just say it, in Trump's America. But, back then in 1919, they really said it. So this idea of an undesirable alien. So not alien from outer space, but referring particularly to those Eastern European immigrants. And that's where I come back to in the war. The Great War, or First World War, is that in fighting against the Austro-Hungarian Empire, at that time, Ukraine was parts of Ukraine were part of that. It was those people who were targeted, and Austrian became a bad word. And as things go on, so things have been relatively peaceful. People have been, standing strong in their resolve to strike. But one of the groups who is largely in favor of the right to unionize and to strike are the police. And so on June 9th, the police are told that they must sign what people call the Slave Act, basically promising that they will not join a union or support any kind of strike or go on strike. And the vast majority of them would not sign this agreement, and almost the whole Winnipeg police force is fired, and they're replaced by an untrained volunteer corps called the Special Constables or Special Police. And the Labor News calls them out and says, that the police are replaced by thugs. So basically, these are untrained men who are basically given batons. That was special police that we saw in that first now and then photo. And they're just hiring volunteers from the community. And again, to give you a little bit of a flavor of what some of the parameters of thinking were at the time. One of the men in this photo here, his name is Francis Hughes. So you can see them posing with the wooden batons that they were issued as volunteers. He actually ended up being a volunteer firefighter rather than police officer, but he had to sign this special oath. I'm just going to read it out to you. It's very different from what we would think of police today. So the oath said, I, Francis Hughes of Winnipeg in the province of Manitoba, do sincerely promise and swear that I will bear faithful and true allegiance to His Majesty King George V, as the lawful sovereign of the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Ireland, and on this province dependent, i.e. Canada, and belonging to said kingdom, and that I will defend him to the utmost of my power against all traitorous conspiracies and attempts whatsoever, which may be against his person, crown, or dignity, and that I will do my utmost to endeavor to disclose and make known to His Majesty, his heirs or successors, all treason or traitorous conspiracies and attempts which I may know to be against him or any of them. And all this I swear without equivocation, mental evasion, or secret reservation. So help me God. So me, that seems like, quite an extreme thing to be promising when one is going to be a volunteer firefighter. But that sort of just shows you the perceived threat of this time to the order and from the king on down. And so this divided our city. Now, one of the very favorite things that in our exhibit is we have conversations between people. So I'm going to play you one of these conversations. So this is, these two gentlemen are based on real individuals and real individuals' stories. This is Martin, and this is Frederick. And so I'm just going to play their conversation. So you can see subtitles if you can't quite understand.
Stop with the music, bud.
Just trying to lift my spirits. Tough times, with the strike.
Don't I know it? I'm joining the special police tomorrow. This strike has got to end.
Well then, I will see you on the streets. I'm striking.
What? I didn't win a Victoria Cross during the Great War just to come back here to no job and to see enemy aliens from Eastern Europe striking in the streets.
Hey, I'm no enemy alien. I tried to volunteer for the war, twice. And by the way, most of the strikers are English.
But you weren't born here.
No, I was born in Galicia. But I've been here since I was 10. And this is my country too. I wanted to fight for Canada and the Union Jack.
People like you would have enlisted and then turned on us on the battlefield. You would have supported the enemy, your fatherland.
I wanted to help Canada, but they called us aliens and made us carry identification papers. No one would hire us. We weren't even allowed to go to America to look for work. A bunch of us did anyway.
What are you doing here then?
Well, police stopped us at the border and forced us to march to the internment camp in Brandon. I escaped from that place twice.
That just means you got caught twice.
Yeah. All I wanted was a job. I wanted the job for the same reasons you want work. To buy food and a better place to live. What girl is going to go with a fellow who doesn't have a job?
Yeah, that's true. Anyway, I won't be stuck here much longer. I'm a returned soldier. The papers say soldiers will get work easily.
Maybe they tell you that so you won't join the strike. Most veterans support the strike.
I gave everything for this country. Employers won't forget that. Well, I guess I'll see you on the streets tomorrow. Watch out for yourself.
I'll watch out for both of us.
Yeah, so that's, as I said, is my favorite thing in the exhibit, because it touches on so many interesting topics. And as I said, they're based on real people. And I will put a shout out there to Mr. Polly, whose grandfather is also featured in our exhibit. I didn't pull that audio today. But this one, yeah, so this one is sort of a fictionalized conversation. And one of the things is that both of these are two immigrants, but one of them is British, one of them is Ukrainian, and they're having a very different experience. Are you wanting to move on to questions, Erin, or? Oh, and you're just muted.
Oh, how embarrassing. We do have a couple of questions, but if you've got some information, I think this group would probably be keen to hear more of what you have to say.
Sure, yeah, I still have a bit more to go, but yeah, I'm probably not using I'm probably talking a little bit too much, but yeah, do you want to shoot one of the questions now, or do you want me just to keep going for now?
You keep going, and I'll save the last couple minutes for some questions.
Okay, perfect. I will speed up. And so the gentleman, Frederick there, he would go and join the special police, and on June 10th, there would be a confrontation in the street between the special police constables and the strikers. And the strikers kicked their butt, basically. And Frederick Coppins became very famous because not only was he a war hero, so he was a Victoria Cross winner, but as a special police constable who was pulled off his horse and beat up, he became sort of a rallying cry. And I'm just going to read you quickly some of the things they said in the newspaper about him. And it said, this man, so in this conflict, yesterday afternoon rode down the streets of Winnipeg and once more united with the forces of democracy and sworn to maintain law and order. From the sidewalks, mobs howled, scab at him. And they tore him from his horse, and 3 alien enemies trampled him in the streets. That man was Sergeant Fred Coppins, BC. And today he lies suffering in a tuxedo hospital, the victim of cowardly assault by Austrians. How long will human decency, how long will human decency lie dormant in face of these occurrences? Appeals to reason are futile where there is no reason to appeal to. And so this appeared in the Winnipeg Telegram the next day. After that man, Frederick Coppins, was the special police constable who was beat up. It was put there by the Citizens Committee of 1000. Who had like the best marketing brains, because they were probably maybe a group of a few dozen businessmen in Winnipeg who organized against the strike, but they called themselves the Citizen Committee. But the language that they're using in that little article really shows this division in the city. And these businessmen behind the Citizens Committee, they would encourage the arrest of the strike leaders. And behold, they're not enemy aliens. Most of these strike leaders are a British background, and these sort of rumors and that we should be deporting all these people really doesn't hold true. And so on June 17th, the strike leaders are arrested, and they're arrested for seditious conspiracy. So basically saying that they're trying to start a revolution, that they're trying to overthrow the government. And their arrest would lead to a silent protest, a silent parade of veterans through the downtown streets of Winnipeg on June 21st. And despite the peaceful nature of these demonstrations, the Northwest Mounted Police would be called in to break up this demonstration. The Riot Act was read. That meant that basically everybody had to go home or they would be arrested. And so June 21st would become known as Bloody Saturday. And so many in the crowd, took exception to this disruption of their demonstration. The most sort of provocative move early on was, even though the streetcar workers were on strike, was volunteers sent a streetcar down Main Street. This was stopped by the strikers, and in the famous tipping over of the streetcar, and it was lit on fire. So things really begin to escalate until not only are the Northwest Mounted Police charging through the streets with batons, but they are also shooting and 2 men are shot and will die. And hence called Bloody Saturday. But also, many of the demonstrators are herded into an alley where untold numbers of them are beat up by the special constables and the Northwest Mounted Police. So a very big controversy. And so my second last slide, Erin, is that, so, we often think of that moment of pushing over the streetcar, but for me, the June 21st Bloody Saturday, this is sort of the photo that I think of, is by the end of the day, the Canadian Army had been sent in to take over the streets. And so here we see soldiers along Main Street, and what they have in the back of this truck here is a machine gun. So a real huge show of force by the Canadian government. And so many of those returned soldiers would have understood, the potential horror and damage that could be caused by a machine gun. And so this is sort of the beginning and end of the strike. Our labor leaders are put on trial. Some of them are convicted, some of them are not. But they have, started a conversation. And this is my final slide, that prison bars cannot confine ideas. And many of these strike leaders will go on, even while they're still in prison, be elected to city council, to the legislature, and eventually to Ottawa. And many of them are involved in the formation of the CCF that would eventually become the New Democratic Party, but taking these ideas forward. So the general strike did not win them the rights that they wanted, but it would forever change our political landscape here in Canada. So that is my last slide. And so here we have a few questions.
We at UFCW are standing on the backs of all those people who so bravely did that at a time when there wasn't any other support. They didn't have a social support system. Okay, we only have a couple of minutes and we did have a couple of questions. The first one was, do you know if there were Indigenous people who were living in Winnipeg at that time?
Yeah, well, absolutely. So, as I mentioned before, there was this pass system that made freedom of movement for Indigenous people. That's really a dark time. But there certainly is, at this time, an area of Winnipeg called Roostertown. It's where Grant Park Mall is. There's a Métis community there. But there's not really an obvious, sort of Indigenous presence in the city here at that time.
Where was that community actually in Winnipeg now? Where would it have been?
Roostertown. Roostertown would be where Grant Park Mall is. And where they've just built the new library by the Pan Am Pool in that area there. And the new City of Winnipeg Library is based on architecture from Roostertown. And inside the library, there are exhibits about Roostertown. And someday, hopefully, we can go into a library and see that and learn more about Roostertown. Yeah.
Someone else wanted to know how involved were hospital and healthcare workers in the 1919 strike?
Okay, great question. And so that back to, who's in charge. One of the first issues was this delivery of milk to the Children's Hospital. And actually, I was listening to a podcast, just getting back into the general strike mode last night, and they were telling the story that there was a huge storm during the strike. It was like, you have to realize this is hot. This is May and June, and there's a big thunderstorm one night that damaged the roof of the Children's Hospital. And some workers came down and said, hey, we know what we're doing, we could help you. And some hospital officials refused their help to repair the roof of the hospital because they were on strike and they didn't want to associate with those workers. But it's interesting, there was cases of doctors basically approaching the strike committee to sort of, can we get permission to operate? Like to continue on. A lot of professionals, though, saw themselves as like different from workers who would be joining unions at that time. So teachers, for example, the Manitoba Teachers Society had just been formed about that time, but they didn't see themselves as workers in the same way, and it wasn't a union in the same way. So as far as I know, there wasn't that same kind of movement for workers' rights within like the healthcare field.
But there was still 30,000 other people who took part.
Absolutely.
One final question, and then we'll probably have to wrap things up. And it's not a question so much as somebody just wanted to point out, what lessons can we learn from what happened then and apply them to now? So maybe not so much a question, but something for all of us to think about as we're going through some difficult times ourselves right now. I did want to wrap things up on time, and we're darn close to doing that. So Anya, thank you so much for joining us. I saw a lot of people had a lot of interest in this topic. There was people hoping that we'll have another part 2 and a part 2, and maybe that's something that we can talk about. For those of you who are our members, thank you so much for being here tonight. If you're not a UFCW member and you're curious about how to become a unionized workplace, you can always go to our website. You can see it on your screen right there, ufcw832.com. This is where you'll end up, and that part down here where it says join UFCW. If you're looking to have a union in your workplace, this is the way to do it. Thank you, Anya, so much for being with us tonight. And thank you to all of you for tuning in. Really great to see so many people are interested in this history. Thank you, and good night, everybody.
Thank you.